Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Horror these days is a pretty broad word and encapsulates many different subgenres deeply unique and distinct from one another. You can find overtly gory tales of zombies in malls, or even subtle as sack-of-brick stories of home invaders hacking and slashing their way through impure teenagers. But under the same umbrella, you'll also find stories of human drama and tragedy, where the supernatural is just a veil for the real-life terrors that we do not understand and our inability to deal with them. And even then, there are more bizarre tales of just being a speck of dust, an ant in the guise of forces far beyond our comprehension, driving us to the brink of insanity. I bring this up because outside of things like cosmic horror and a handful of other subgenres, we often overlook interesting underpinnings and common themes of other genres. And one that's been relatively forgotten outside of references is the age-old genre of Gothic horror.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! In the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
Gothic horror can best be described as classic, because it's often what comes to mind when we think of traditions such as Halloween. Classic monsters that we often see depicted as mascots that very few in the modern age truly understand. Authors such as Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu can be seen as the most prominent and important figures, as their writings are not only extremely iconic, but are so influential that their DNA can still be found all over the place today. While there are many staples to Gothic horror, this masterclass article lists some of the most important of them. Though, if I could give the best example here, it would be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. A story of a mad scientist who defies reality by bringing a corpse back to life, only to abandon it in fear, with that monster being shunned from society, and when attempting to strong-arm his creator into giving him a mate to spend his life with, only to suffer when the good doctor denies him his wish, and he seeks revenge on the man who cursed him of his life. Frankenstein contains many of the staples here, that being romance, the supernatural, Victorian architecture, and most importantly, the theme and question that when faced with a supernatural creature, is it them or the men who created them that's the real monster? So as such a classic and important literary genre of Western horror history, what would it look like if someone turned all this into an RPG Maker game? Mad Father is very different from most of its contemporaries, because oftentimes with RPG Maker horror, we encounter stories of surrealism, Silent Hill-esque hauntings, Japanese ghost stories involving high school kids getting a little too deep with the dead, or very anime-inspired tales of terror. But by no means is any of this bad. I mean, it can be goofy, but there's a reason these games are considered cult classics and beloved by many. RPG Maker horror is infamous, Not because it's bad, because it's an odd and cult-beloved scene of many titles, not only important to indie gaming, but internet culture at large. Full of its own cliches and genre underpinnings. But in that list of RPG Maker classics lies a handful of games that break the mold. Mad Father takes a stab at telling a classic Gothic horror tale, and crosses it with the obvious anime and overall Japanese influence. And these two elements end up working far better together than you might expect. Rather than a culture clash of Western Gothic stories of big mansions and the people inside them being far more monstrous than the creatures around them, or even your typical Japanese curses and spirits coming out of the woodwork to torment our main characters, we get a great fusion of the two, where both of these elements' major themes and cliches are used, but crossed in a way where they feel almost seamless. Its story is about a young girl raised by a mad scientist, trapped in a curse that's come to take her father's life, and for the many wrongdoings that he's committed, with a tragic and beautiful story unfolding of ghosts, zombies, and all things that go bump in the night, all wrapped in a tight little bow of a great horror experience. Now, before you get your pitchforks out and scream about how nothing that looks like this can be scary, let's just get into the horror side of things. Boo! Mad Father is obviously going to be trapped by some of the shortcomings of its DNA as an RPG Maker game, with a limited ability to graphically convey things and gameplay about as basic as what can be done with a SNES controller. Despite this, what makes it all so much fun is how much it plays with its perspective, often zooming in and zooming out in different situations to help create a sense of unease and surprise within the player, with the dimly lit lighting of the mansion itself creating an incredibly creepy atmosphere. Now, it's easy to scoff at RPG Maker games thinking they all act like Yume Nikki, relying on surrealism in the graphics, or just jump scares if you're a fan of trash like The Crooked Man. But Mad Father takes a far more traditional approach, feeling far more like a 2D contemporary to a PS1 survival horror game, just without the combat. It lets you sit in uncomfortable safety while using various sound cues and crashes to startle you. Breaking up the little piece that you get, only to once again meet you with a cleverly placed jump scare or enemies you need to run away from. This is built upon as the game progresses, as the danger and overall scares only ramp up as the story plays out, including a lot of blink and you'll miss it moments and environmental storytelling that unfolds as you revisit certain areas. Two of the best examples of this are the maids in the dining room and the doll that sits on the hallway couch. At the very beginning of the game, we are stuck aimlessly exploring the mansion, trying to figure out just what we're supposed to do. Our character Aya has no real idea that anything haunting is going on outside of the strange man that she encounters and some of the odd things that can be construed as simply her own imagination. Directly next to us lies a hallway that has a life-size doll sitting on the couch. To Aya, this is nothing more than a prop, but to us, the player, we know that we're in a horror game, and some fuck shit is going to inevitably happen here. But as we inspect it and walk by it multiple times, nothing ever happens, and it creates a sense of unease. Especially because either right before this or not long after we'll discover this, we'll inevitably make it to the main room and encounter ghosts who do mean us harm. And as we explore more, we meet other ghosts who might not hurt us, but they'll still jump scare us. So it adds a lot more tension to the other dolls that we run into, especially this suspiciously placed one that sits in an area that is otherwise devoid of use besides an alternative staircase that serves as just another way to the bottom floor, meaning that this doll here is integral for something. After a few times of walking past it, the doll will eventually trip us, and it's nothing terrifying, but it definitely takes us off guard as it's not known to us as the player what event triggers this. We'll inspect the doll again and nothing will happen, only to come back once again and find that the doll has been dismembered and is covered in blood, revealed to be the corpse that it really is, with one of the smaller handmade dolls just sitting next to it, covered in the blood of its former friend. It shows that these dolls are not all on the same page or even the same side, with it left ambiguous on if the doll killed the other in retaliation for bullying you, or if it did it of its own volition to simply inflict pain. But all without breaking the fourth wall or using a jump scare, even any real direct danger to Aya or the player. And the sense of uncertainty accentuates the horror to a much deeper level than what you would expect from a cutesy little RPG Maker horror game, especially considering that many of the other classics of the genre are about as scary as Luigi's Mansion. The other example that really shows off how brilliant the environmental storytelling in horror is comes with the dining room. Mad Father uses a save system where, rather than a save room or saving in the files, there are crows placed around the mansion, and we can use these to save or load our game. At first, it may appear that they are save rooms, but as we play, we'll see how fickle they can be at times. One of these quote-unquote save rooms is the dining room, which is filled with its own little scares. But for a good chunk of the game, you can save here. After we reach a key spot in progression, where we get some key notes in the story and enter an entirely new area of the game, upon returning to the dining room, the crow is gone and in its place are 3 maid dolls, each of which greet us in a friendly way when approached. It instantly creates tension because not only have we come across a lot of different dolls and ghosts who do mean us harm, we've also lost a save room. This is supposed to be a safe environment for us, and now in its place are these 3 very conspicuous looking maid dolls that at this point we've already learned are corpses. Upon trying to leave the room, one of them loses an arm, and the other 2 look at it with concern. It causes a moment of even deeper tension, but nothing happens. And if we leave the room and come back later, we'll see that there's only 2 maids now, and in the place of the 3rd that lost her arm is just a giant blood stain and a trail. And if we follow that blood trail, it leads us to the fireplace, where the body has been stuffed away, all while the remaining 2 maids just sit there as if nothing is wrong, still greeting us as normal. And this sort of tension is rife throughout the game, with all these passive events and the actively scary events that are harmful to us. It just builds a really thick and moody atmosphere where we never know when we're truly safe or not, especially when we consistently find more and more eerie environmental pieces just waiting to be discovered and, well, tried out. And this is all while the game's plot thickens and hits us with the most haunting scare of them all, and one that redefines a lot of the other scares that we see in the game, and, well, that's the age-old terror of a wolf in sheep's clothing.
The day of the crime, the father went to the trunk of his car, retrieved the rifle, and shot his wife as she was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch. When his 10-year-old son came to investigate the commotion, the father shot him too.
Now, in order to really dig into the meat of what makes this game a Gothic horror masterpiece, we need to have a basic understanding of the events of the story, or at least a rough synopsis. Mad Father sees this play as the young girl Aya, the only child of parents Monika and Alfred Dervis. The three are a seemingly happy family, despite the questionable career of Alfred, who is shown to the player to be a mad scientist who indulges in depraved experiments on both corpses and the living. Aya knows enough to understand the nature of her father's work, having her own suspicions of just what goes on in his lab, but willingly remaining ignorant to things as much as she can. At some point, a fourth member of the family eventually joins them, a lab assistant to Alfred named Maria, and as you might have guessed, it doesn't take long until the two become romantically inclined, and as a result of Alfred's infidelity, his marriage begins to go down the drain, resulting in him killing his wife and leaving his daughter ignorant of what really happened to her. And a year after this act of homicide, a curse befalls the mansion, leading to the disappearance of Alfred and Aya awaking to his screams and roaming the mansion trying to save him. Now, this is the basis of the game's story, and if you look at things on a surface level, it's extremely simple. It's the tale of a young girl trying to save her father from a curse, only to come face to face with the true evil of his very being, and barely escaping the mansion with her life in order to live on another day. A basic horror plot. But that's kind of what separates Gothic horror from the rest of the pack. Almost all these tales are very basic in their construction, but where they become special and nuanced and where their stylings really show are in the relationships between characters, side stories, and the overt themes that play around the basic constructions of the story itself. There are many examples to give, but one that I'd like to call attention to is Oscar Wilde's Penny Dreadful, a picture of Dorian Gray.
But after a time, you'll lose the desire for passion entirely. For connection with anyone. Like a muscle that atrophies from lack of use. And one day, you'll realize you've become like them.
On the surface, it's a Faustian tale of temptation and corruption, where we follow a young man who finds identity within his vanity, and upon meeting a new friend who shares a very different sense of morality with him, Dorian opts to follow it, and in his pursuits, wishing his portrait would bear age and he would stay beautiful and young forever. And against all odds, he does get his wish, but in a monkey's paw fashion, where the painting doesn't just bear his age, but also the scars and deformities of his soul with each sin he commits. It doesn't take long for Dorian to accept that his life is filled with nothing but vice and sin. His actions and words cause him to push his lover into suicide, and after 18 years of indulgence and debauchery, it leaves many of those around him in death. Eventually, all the guilt and all the frustration fuses with his emptiness, and it all catches up to Dorian, and in a final bid to end the pain, he confesses his sins before stabbing the monstrosity, the visage of his lifestyle and bad decisions, dying in the end, while the portrait becomes the spitting image of his former beauty. Where the main story itself is just a simple one, a man who sells his soul, or in other words, strays from life's good path, only to end up living a life of evil and hedonism, and succumbing to the guilt of his sin in the end, the true horror is actually in the details of the relationships. See, not only did he cause his lover to commit suicide with his actions and words, but Dorian's entire path is set by the friendship and encouragement of Lord Henry, an aristocrat that he made friends with through Basil the painter, the one who created that fateful painting for him. And this is what ended up leading him down that path. The true horror of Dorian's story is that despite getting his wish, no amount of pleasure would ever be enough to fill him in the end. And despite all the good he could do with his unlimited time, he chose to instead indulge in his selfishness, his vanity, and his hedonism. And where it gets even more twisted is that all these events are set off by Lord Henry, who only lived 1 foot in and 1 foot out of his own twisted morality, which created the monster that Dorian becomes. And he fostered that monster with encouragement and even gave him ideas by lending him a book that is implied to be the 120 Days of Sodom, a vile piece of filth from the real world that even led its own writer to imprisonment. Lord Henry's own twisted morality led to the deaths of many of his friends and the ultimate destruction of Dorian himself. And it's these existentialist themes, twisted romantics, and being faced with the fact that the supernatural is not actually the true evil at play, but it's the choices and actions of the men given the chance to have their wish, that really nails Gothic horror. And this is something that we also see play out at the heart of Mad Father. While most RPG Maker protagonists tend to either be blank slates to serve as a surrogate to the player like Madatsuki of Yume Nikki, or even more traditional protagonist types like Hiroshi of Aoni, Aya rather is very unique. Far from a blank slate with a well-defined and prominent personality, Aya is also not a simple protagonist either, and fits the bill for many of the hallmarks. So let's just take a look at them. Outside of maybe the last one, 4 of the 5 staples fit perfectly. Aya's motivations are not to stop evil, survive, or to solve a mystery like the traditional protagonist. Rather, her motivations are fueled by a deep and flawed love of her father, despite knowing that the curse is a result of his own transgressions against the innocent and his infidelity as well. While at the beginning of the game she wasn't privy to just how dark the abyss was, she definitely learns of it as the plot goes on, and is not deterred to stop her on her quest to save him. She's fueled by a mixture of emotions, most prominently being love and devotion for her dad, as well as grief of her mother's passing, desperately trying to keep a promise that she made to her before she died. Aya is also strong in her pursuits to do what she feels she needs to do, but is easily persuaded to both go off the beaten path as well as pursue actions she previously wouldn't have, whether it be at the behest of Ogre, Sen's G-Man-esque figure, or if it's the asks of the various ghosts who inhabit the mansion. And without getting ahead of myself, that anti-hero point stands very firm, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Aya is only half of the Gothic horror puzzle. While we follow her on her own journey, it's one that's fueled, motivated, and created out of the consequences of her father's actions and choices. So before we go further on Aya herself, let's talk about Alfred. Alfred might not be the protagonist, but he really is the true main character of the story. It's all his choices that he's made and his actions that have not only just caused the events in the game, but the revelations that we make about him and how he interacted with both the world and his own family. I mean, the game is even named after the dude. While Alfred's personality and overall character may come across as complex, he's actually pretty simple to understand. The man is a manipulative psychopath turned mad scientist. He may seem compassionate and loving when speaking to his daughter, Maria, and even his wife Monika, but the reality is he simply does what he has to further his own goals in indulging in the taboo research and experiments that he loves so much, with it ultimately being just a part of his actual love of murder. Alfred from a young age showed typical signs of being a serial killer, beginning with animals, moving on to his loved ones, and eventually settling down enough to create a good life for himself to indulge in his depraved desires. He eventually fuses his interest in medical science and murder to find his true love of turning corpses into dolls, Frankensteining his victims into various creations. Alfred's character in particular seems to be heavily inspired by a mixture of the aforementioned Dr. Frankenstein and the lesser-known Herbert West, H.P. Lovecraft's own take on the mad scientist who likes to operate on corpses and play God. Each of his relationships are simply there to serve a purpose in this obsession. He may be kind-hearted for taking in Maria and giving her a chance to be his assistant, but if it wasn't for the fact that she had skills to aid in his experiments, she would have ended up a doll herself. And as for his daughter, Alfred seems compassionate and loving, even using his scientific knowledge to clone her rabbit Snowball every time that Aya accidentally injures him fatally, something that she never actually knew about either. But at the end of the day, Alfred's love for his daughter ends at his desire to turn her into a doll when she reaches the perfect age. With no uncertain terms, Alfred may be human, but with absolute no subtlety, it's clear that despite how monstrous or forwardly murderous many of the ghosts we meet in the mansion are, none of them would exist without Alfred's creation, and his own bloodlust and sadism outweighs all the ghosts that we see. Now, how this relates back to Aya and the overall Gothic horror theme that's going on here is much like Dorian Gray or even Frankenstein in terms of the relationships between the characters and how it all plays together in showing the bigger story that's going on. Now, Aya's journey, as we've established, is a very simple one, and it could be over as soon as maybe 10 minutes if she just headed straight to the basement and saved her father. But the game pushes us around due to some of the PS1 style puzzles, and through them we do learn more and more about not only our father, but the various ghosts in the mansion. These interactions are not only what fleshes out the game's story, but really hammers in its themes. As stated before, Maria wasn't hired as a maid or an assistant. She was brought in to be another body to harvest doll parts from. But what makes this more twisted is that she wasn't some poor kidnapped woman taken by a traditional serial killer. Maria was a poor homeless teenage girl that Alfred saw being beaten on the street and then offered his home and accommodations to, only changing his mind when he sees that she has an aptitude and skill for medical care. And it's this kindness that causes a form of Stockholm Syndrome where Maria gives her undying devotion to Alfred and turns a blind eye to his many evils, even falling in love with him as time goes on. And as messed up as that is, Maria's story is actually one of the more tame ones, as she at least gets to live. This sadistic and manipulative nature of Alfred goes far deeper. Another story that we see play out is when Aya meets a friendly ghost, who acts as a guardian to her. Robin is a boy who was also taken in by the doctor. While we don't know much about his past, he is confirmed to be orphaned, with his parents and sister passing away in an accident, leaving him left to the streets. Alfred does the same thing that he did with Maria, but allows the boy to believe that he is actually going to be part of the family, and even asks him to be a big brother and guardian to Aya, only to later kill him and harvest his eye. It wasn't enough that he was just another victim, as Alfred had to give him time, in this case a few months, to develop a false sense of hope and security. And Alfred would do this to many of his victims, bringing in vulnerable people, sometimes men, but predominantly women and children, taunting them with the idea of them being saved and introducing them to his family, giving them a sense of hope and relief, only to relish in taking it away once again. This is a story that Aya sees play out a few times, and it gives much greater context to the other dolls that we see in the mansion. The previously mentioned maids who appear in the dining room are now implicated in being other women like Maria, brought in to serve as caretakers, only to be lambs led to slaughter. And the corpse that we see on the couch is possibly another child told that they would be an older sister, hence their playful tripping of Aya, rather than just a violent attack like many of the others. Something seen in a ghost that we even get to talk to, who was brought in and sold that very same lie, meeting Aya as an infant, only to meet an ever so familiar fate. Aya's journey is not her own. It's a walk through memory lane where we discover not just that every doll we come across was once a living person, but we come to see the fruit of Alfred's labor, the many sins that he's committed, and just how much of a monster he really is, making previous scenes from the beginning of the game, like when we set a pile of dolls on fire, all the more haunting, as we didn't just burn a bunch of monsters or even just lifeless dolls, we sacrificed the victims, once again putting them through the pain of death. And Aya even comes face to face with that death once she defeats her mother and saves Alfred, only for him to turn his attention on her and decide that it's finally time to turn her into a doll himself. With the final stretch of the game closing the story off by having us run from the deranged and completely broken-minded Alfred before we finally see him die. Aya's journey ends with her leaving the mansion with Maria and Snowball, though still being stuck with a twisted love for her father intact, hinting that his influence may not have truly left the world, even after his passing and his research burnt to ashes. Though Alfred isn't the only wolf in sheep's clothing that we learn about, Aya's mother Monika is also not so savory of a person. We spend most of the game seeing her as a righteous, vengeful spirit, taking vengeance on her husband who killed her. But the truth is, she comes from an equally twisted background as Alfred, and is actually where the Dervis family name comes from, as Alfred was from a poor, unnamed family, and Monika had actually come from wealth. She was the granddaughter of a cult leader, her grandfather being the progenitor of the doll research that Alfred would later champion. Monika was also a sadist, and found pleasure in torture and violence, developing an interest in serial killers to the point where when she came face to face with one via Alfred, she fell deeply in love. As you could guess, at some point the two became a couple, and Monika gave him access to her family's secrets and research. She wasn't just a passive wife who turned a blind eye to the evil of her husband, but was an active participant, relishing in all of it, and took deep pleasure in the sadism, torture, and slaughter of the innocent, even encouraging Aya to play rough with her pet bunny in order to normalize death and suffering to her. And this is something that we don't really learn through the main game. It only comes through in Blood Mode, where we get even more access to the story and have a lot more things fleshed out for us as the player. Again, linking back to something like Gothic Horror, where when you reread books like Carmilla or Dracula, the more times you read them, the more times you pick up different elements, different beats in the stories and different nuances that you would have missed. Just here, it's done by expanding the game little by little with each new addition to it, creating a gameplay loop for something that used to require much more work as an actual read-through of some admittedly overly long and kind of hard to read books. Now, I did just mention Gothic Horror, and speaking of it, I mentioned earlier that anti-heroes were a staple, and this rings true for Mad Father as well. Though the way Gothic Horror handles anti-heroes is much different from the modern edgy sad boy Shadow the Hedgehog approach that we see today.
Discovering the secret of my past will be nearly impossible. I'll take those odds.
Rather, the concept of the anti-hero that we find within Gothic fiction are more like cases such as Frankenstein. To bring him up, for the millionth time. In a certain lens, Frankenstein can be seen as a hero, as he does lure his monster to the only place that he can think of that he can really trap him in order to save humanity. And if his theory of allowing his monsters to procreate ended up being true, he did save humanity by denying that monster his wish of a wife. But these humanity-saving deeds are not done out of the kindness of his heart. It's merely Dr. Frankenstein being stuck handling the consequences of his actions, and his own guilt and fear forcing him to go out and be the hero in a situation that his own ego and hubris created. And that's not even mentioning that his monster also wasn't a force of evil to the world, but merely a tragic creature stuck in a world that would not accept or understand him. While both Aya's parents are varying degrees of evil, Aya herself isn't a bloodthirsty killer in that same way. Her experiences in the mansion set her on a much more peaceful path, but her bloodline and natural inclinations due to her family's nature do still persist. In the epilogue of the game, Aya is shown as an adult, running her own clinic in the middle of nowhere. A practice that apparently doesn't even charge its patients. Thanks to some dialogue we get as Maria and Aya leave the mansion, the fact that this scenario is just a little too good to be true leaves the atmosphere far more eerie, since there's obviously something wrong here. And at the end of the scene, we are met with that truth, as Aya painlessly kills the girl who came to her clinic, and Maria reflects that she's just like her father, while we see a new collection of small dolls in the next room. Aya has gone down a similar path to her father, but it's the final reveal of the game that gives us an even bigger truth. Aya's dolls are not a homage to her father, but rather the victims that he had left behind. Robin's parting words to her was to never forget him and the others, as they all had no families, and would, in a greater scheme of things, not even exist to the rest of the world because no one else would remember them. Aya, while still indulging in murder like her parents, has become more of an anti-hero than a villain, as her victims are terminally ill people that she gives a peaceful death to, and her dolls are a homage to those that would be forgotten. While it's not the most savory or heroic deed, it is one that offers a peaceful way to end the pain of the poor and sick, and one done with more kindness than malice. She may be taking lives, but rather than stealing them from the innocent and the downtrodden, she offers a painless and peaceful death to the unfortunate souls who contract uncurable illnesses, allowing them to pass in the comfort of kind company. In essence, a heroic deed, but one that is still morally gray and, to some, still evil. So in essence, she becomes an anti-hero. Mad Father is an intricate and well-crafted puzzle. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than your typical RPG Maker horror game with a Victorian coat of paint. But once you begin to dig into it just a little bit beyond its surface, the true depth of its themes and story become apparent. Earlier on, I called it a Gothic horror masterpiece, and while that might sound like a bit of an overstatement, I do actually think it rings true. Now, not in terms of comparing to the classic pieces of literature of the past, because it obviously deviates a bit from a lot of the traditions and isn't nearly as deep and complex as most of the catalog here, but in terms of video games, I can't really think of any others that hit this close to catching all the hallmarks of a great Gothic horror tale. Outside of books and the literary world at large, there aren't really a lot of things that can capture Gothic horror. A few films for sure, but it's a hard genre to portray outside of its literary roots, due to just how complex it can be and how much it really needs monologues and long conversations to flesh itself out. leading to most visual mediums failing to convey it without it becoming a boring slog. By using repeat playthroughs as a mechanic and taking a drip-feed approach to storytelling, Mad Father is able to accurately convey its themes, and what culminates is a simple yet heartfelt tale of familial love and the consequence of evil, the true depths of the depravity of man, and how far a once normal person can fall. But also, it's how these same trappings and evil inclinations can be turned around for the greater good. Alfred and Monika may represent the very worst of humanity, but their daughter, as scared and traumatized as she might have been, was still able to find a way to turn those same traits into something good, and slowly right the wrongs of her family bloodline. One of the consistent themes and elements of Gothic horror is its propensity of bad endings. Even if the monsters and villains are stopped, it's usually at the cost of our protagonist's life, or a stalemate of tragedy. And it's the way that Mad Father breaks this rule and tradition that really allows it to stand not only unique, but possibly even a cut above a lot of the rest, allowing us to see a equally happy ending while still keeping enough tragedy and horror to allow the entire thing to stick in our minds long after we close out the game. But with that being said, before we go, I'd like to introduce you to my wall of shame. These are my glorious, generous, and eternally demanding patrons, the pay piggies who keep the lights on and have me chained to the computer, making the sweet, sweet content that you love to watch. So, if you'd like to join them on this wall of shame and show your support, consider throwing me a donation on Ko-fi or becoming a patron. Your support helps more than you know, and I couldn't even begin to express my gratitude. But on that note, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, join the Discord server, and I'll see you in the next video.